people won the game. Handled their business. Happy trolls. How many happy trolls? Even though we're not cheering, we're really happy for you. She probably cheated. How many superstars?
Okay.
Anybody want a superstar? How many bounce balls?
Oops.
How many slinkies?
One time, but I ended up at
I jinxed him? Yeah, you probably just wore yourself out all the practice. Sure. And then how many people, just the game's stupid, couldn't get anywhere, silly buddy? I think, first of all, more and more, like, we're not shaking hands as people, we're texting hello, and so it's good to get up and shake some of your hands. I think, in lots of ways, this is kind of the evolution of people when they connect to our communities. They don't always start as silly putty, but I think, especially at the beginning, we could see this transition if we do it right. We could see people starting out as silly putty. They're here. They're willing to be molded into what's going on. They're impressionable. From that point, they might become slinkies, kind of wavering. They're halfway in, halfway out. But it's a really neat thing when we see people connect to our communities and they become bouncy balls and they start moving. And they start kind of developing a path that might or might not be where we intended for them to go when we put them into our institution. But they start moving. And then a little less, but some become superstars and they shine within our community. And those that are willing to be patient with us in our communities of faith, some of them, regardless of what we do when they get to this point, become happy trolls. They're just content. They might not always like us, but they love us. They found their place. This is their spiritual home. But I suggest to you that this might not be what's happening anymore. That we're not finding people that fit the nice mold of coming in, finding a space, excelling, creating a new space, and then being here happily ever after. I don't think we're getting as many silly putties as we used to. I think there are people, the worst part about watching the game be played out is watching the person who's just trying but can't find another of their kind to connect with. Slinky! And you get to a point where, is that the only one? Like, I felt like I was the only silly putty in the room for a while after everybody had moved on, and I'm like, oh, maybe it's just me. I think that what we might be seeing is less connect because there are people that aren't seeing people they relate with, and there may be people that look at the process and say, you know what, I'm not plugging in here. I'm not sure this process works for me exactly. Phyllis Tickle, the historian, talks about how for so long the church was believe, then behave, and then belong. You get a group of people that believe the same thing. You connect. You start acting out the same ways. You start doing the mission. You start doing the worship. You start doing the Bible study. You're in the forced family fun. You start behaving a certain way. And then after a certain amount of time, you belong. I think that's the way it was. And again, the church slow to recognize change, I think. We might be looking at something that doesn't work so well anymore when we look at believe, then behave, and then belong. Go ahead.
The LDS Church is exactly that, and they're one of the most successful in the country.
What's that?
The LDS Church is exactly that, and they're one of the most successful in the country. How do you account for that?
Can we talk about that at the end?
Sure. Sure.
I think it's a good question. I don't mean to dismiss it, but I think we could really open that up and have good conversation for that. The short response is, well, we might be we might be a brand that's already different than that. And part of who we're looking for, part of who we believe our message needs to be going to are people that aren't looking to do, believe, behave, belong. But I think we could talk about that some more. I don't want to give that a short answer because I think it's a good question. One that I'm frankly not qualified to answer, but there's my opinion. But first, before that, what I want to do is hear from you in a personal setting, because I don't want to move forward and I don't want to talk about today yet. I first want to address the believe, behave, belong, because it worked for so long. And I think what we need to do is celebrate the stories that have been working. And so what I'd like to ask a few of you to do is tell me your story, tell us your story about connecting with a church. Now here's the complicated thing. Due respect. In this forum, I'm not asking for you to tell your personal story. I'd like to tell your generational story. Understanding that there are many of you that have different stories within that. But what I want to hear is, did you connect with the church for the first time in the 60s? If so, what was going on with technology? What was going on in the world, in the country? Listen, we know where we're going with this. We're going to talk about the technology and circumstances of the world today and how the church responds. What I'd first like to hear is, what was your connection point? As a kid in the 50s? As an adult in the 80s? 3 years ago? Actually, if it's 3 years ago, that'll pretty much be today, so. You can talk. We'll just edit you out. Go ahead.
Well, I know in the 60s, when I was in high school, I remember going to my Presbyterian minister, and I actually called him on the phone instead of going to the party, and said, I've got to talk to you tonight. And he let me come over to his home, and we had a chit-chat, and I said, I'm tired of Jolly Green Giant God. I don't want somebody up there telling me that I'm a sinner. And, I went on and on and on. And he had some good things to say, and I felt better. And then I left, and I didn't go back to church. My parents allowed us not to go. I didn't go back to church until I was in Houston at Unity Church, and that was in the 80s. And so in the 80s, when I found Unity, I felt open. I was more mature.
Okay, but what about the 80s? What was going on in the 80s with your culture, with your generation?
Well, I just started working. I mean, not just. Basically. I just started working, and, there was no internet. And Vietnam War, there were all kinds of issues going on, and I felt like I needed some kind of connection. I wasn't married, wasn't with family, so I went into that church and found a home.
Okay, I heard one of the things, Vietnam War, and I think, I don't want to pretend to be speaking for that time, but what I've heard folks share about is, during this time of war and civil disobedience even, there was a need to express some sort of desire, need, passion for social justice. What's going on? Somebody else want to tell their generational story. What was going on when you were connecting to the church? What was the technology like?
Well, in the 70s, we didn't have any technology.
Sure you did. You had a record player, a discotheque era.
Well, I mentioned before we had Pong, and we thought that was fascinating. But my generation didn't have the kind of connectivity that we have technology-wise. So our relationships very much depended on our parents, who at the time, like many of my parents do today, you're going to church, don't ask any questions, just get into the car. And that was the way it went. Now, we plugged in various arenas, and between myself and my peers, some of us plugged in better than others, as you were mentioning in the game. Some of us became the bouncing balls, and some of us, with recognition in our own churches, became the superstars or whatever, and stayed connected. But then after confirmation, you bless the children, they all vanish, which I highly recommend for a church disciplinarian. Just confirm them to leave.
Confirm.
But the idea is I stayed connected. I saw more of my friends same generation. Graduation. Here we are in 1982 when I saw my first vision of MTV when I was in 6th grade. So the MTV generation was just beginning. The idea of music on television instead of just on the radio was kind of a blast of new technology, cable television. This idea where, oh, look, here's oodles of more time-sucking TV, mind-sucking TV for you to watch. It became more. Oh, and by the way, McDonald's has now supersized. That's just the way it was in my generation growing up.
When I discovered church, it would have been probably towards the later 60s when I was starting to plug in. Hammond organs was the most popular style of electronics for church. If you had a Hammond organ, you were uptown,
Yeah.
as opposed to just the standard piano. Because I was in smaller churches, we didn't have the pipe organs. So that was the technology.
I'm a little older. I went back and I was plugged in the 50s.
Good, tell me about it.
Yeah, before you were born. But it was post-World War II.
Yeah.
A lot of vets in college coming back to school. The LP records were coming in. Hi-Fi was getting popular. You could even have stereo if you could afford it. Big bands were really popular. Miller and so on.
How about when did Nixon resign?
And TV was just starting.
Anybody join the church around that time? Do you have something to say?
Yeah, I kind of connected with the church in like junior high in the late 60s. Vietnam War was going on in our living room, television, everything was shown, and lost family there, and took myself to church. I'd been raised early, but it was a way to, I think, probably meet other people. Thought it was going to meet other people, and it was, and then the world was just so divided between like my sisters who are 10 years older than I am and me about what we thought about what was right, about what was happening. And there was, and I just left. I mean, there was no fairness. There was nothing seemed right about what was happening. And I went to college and we did a lot of exploring there, and still, that's not right. Didn't feel right. Didn't feel good. And after I had my first child a few years later, and that was late 70s, was when I went back to church because I felt like I needed that for, I have a child, this is the right thing to do with the child. It took me back, but there was still a lot of drifting until I found the UCC because it talked to the child about challenging, questioning, what do you think this means, as opposed to let me tell you what this means.
Did any of you feel in some of these earlier generations, I brought up Nixon resigning because for me, as I heard you explain, there was national now distrust of leadership.
No, there's no trust.
Institutional and individual, which is, something that I think continues, but probably certainly was amplified at some point then. Well, I think, what's going on today. These were my thoughts, and then I want to hear from you. Political entertainment. I'm not naming networks. I just think there's a lot of them out there where, they all have news after them. But you've got all kinds of pundits and radio shows and political entertainment. Hyperconnectivity, in one sense. And by that I mean more of the always have our phones with us, check our emails on vacation, have a calendar that reminds us that we were supposed to pick up the milk 2 hours ago. Social media I have different. I know that that's connectivity, but as I said before, to me what changes about social media is it's the first technology invented, or first communication medium invented, that's driven by the bottom as opposed to the top. radio, TV, internet. It's all those who have, those in power disseminating information. And there's ways for others to catch on the way down. But with social media, you have the masses. You have anybody able to get information out. It's kind of like the congregational church. The beauty is everybody gets a voice. The tragedy is that 24-hour programming. And I don't necessarily mean just on television, although I think that's part of it. But I think what we'll find when we talk about our experiences with what's going on in church today is that our families, our congregation members are programmed to the highest tilt. There's something going on all the time. And I'll say that for a second. Dualism, which is in a lot of ways good, because maybe saying we don't know all the answers is a healthy thing. But dualism, triplism, quadruplism, how do we as a church then confront a voice with passion in a time where we're also saying, and many of us are saying, yeah, no one really knows. I mean, it could be, explaining to our teenagers why our church is not a live and let live kind of church. I heard one of my teenagers in the group say, yeah, no, our church, we don't care about that. Wait, it's not that we don't care. Okay, never mind. And then certainly mass violence. And it's really ironic that, David and I were talking over a year ago, and I don't even know how to speak to a group close to Aurora, Colorado about mass violence. I feel like I should be listening to you. But I certainly feel like this is an epidemic of mass violence growing, particularly within our younger communities. In our mostly Caucasian, affluent communities, that is not stopping yet. And I think that the coverage is picking up, and the discussion is there, but I certainly think that to a large extent, we're just confronting this for, in my opinion, the first time. The question to you is, what are the symptoms? You can give me a reason why if you want, but what are we seeing in church today? Are we seeing less commitment in terms of attendance? Are we seeing less people coming to our retreats and summer camps? Are we seeing less giving? What are you seeing? Let's put it on the board.
Everything you just said.
Yeah, everything you just said.
But also people are coming for entertainment.
Does anybody else stand at the door shaking hands on the way out? That was awesome. You did great. What? Did great. Okay, yeah, I agree. Entertainment value. Yeah, church was good. Went a little long. The episode ran over time. It was okay. I thought it lost a little steam around the children's moment, but they picked it back up, so it's still
Even
good.
had it been an episode of Downton Abbey, they would have been fine to win an hour 15.
Right. Well, because they could have paused it. Yeah.
In our congregation, membership is being redefined. Younger people who are attracted to the congregation don't want to be a member the way it used to be defined. They come regularly, they're active, they're involved, they're committed, but they don't want to be a member.
Yes. Now,
Can we expand that too? Because I even have older couples joining the church that actually haven't. And I'm having people step up to volunteer and to do roles that typically our former Constitution and bylaws said it could only be done by active members. And actually, I think there's still some language in there, and I've just completely ignored it because our active members won't do it. And our non-members, but regular attendees.
Anybody lost a volunteer because the bylaws said you had to be a member?
Yeah, I usurped the bylaws at that point.
You serve the bylaws. Okay. Can we define it? Or what you said? Or what you said? Grammar remix. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry, Mom. Are you saying that we're seeing less adherence or passion for polity?
Less stretch. Well, probably demand for less hierarchy within the church, whether that's written.
It's not just in the church.
No.
Correct.
Throughout the whole society.
Yeah.
There's
People-
also a reluctance to make long-term commitments. You used to sign up for 3 years on the committee, and that doesn't work anymore. It needs to be more activity or short-term
Yeah.
oriented than it used to be.
Yeah, even
Doesn't matter
if,
how old they are.
Yeah.
Oh,
I had 30 kids in my confirmation class, and the next year I wanted to make it a 2-year program. I had 3 people signing up and calling these families. They said, we're very interested, but boy, 2 years. And it's like, are you kidding me? The Catholics do 9. You're getting a steal.
well, it's worse than that. I mean, I find people not being able to commit for a week. You know, I mean, literally, I can't make a commitment because I don't know what I'm going to be doing next week.
In what? Like, what are you looking for commitments for in a week that you're not getting?
Oh, being a liturgist, getting something for the potluck, you name it. And because they want to keep their options open. Keeping options open is always important these days.
You know, it's funny because we had this conversation surrounding teens, and we're talking about it was really aggravating to the youth leaders in the room that when the teenager would say, yeah, I don't know if I'll be there, depends what we're doing, but I don't know, I'm not sure. But I think what we were hearing in this context is, yeah.
Yeah, there's a real loose sense of commitment in general. I mean, even committing to being at worship at 11 o'clock. Yeah, we might wander in at 10 after. Maybe we'll go over to the community house and we'll wander on over it, you know, when you're in the midst of your sermon. And we'll get up at the, you know, in the middle of prayers and go back over to the community house and work on our coffee. I mean, there's just no sense of commitment to any kind of schedule.
Are we seeing any hesitancy to commit financially comparatively?
Yes.
Well, we'd like to pledge, but we don't know what we're going to be making next year, so.
Depends who wins the election.
No, that's precisely right.
Do you think some of that time commitment is a reaction to an over scheduled society?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, I do.
Yeah.
I do. Yes, yes.
It's also a what's in it for me society, and that goes along with the commitment. Because if I don't see where it's going to benefit me to commit to that, then I'm not going to do it. Right. Not to say that I like that.
I would say too, there's sort of been a shift to like professionalizing aspects of ministry, like where they want to pass everything off to paid staff, you know, whereas they used to be more volunteer
Preach.
driven.
Preach. Which is ironic because the numbers that they email us are that we're going to have to become bivocational in the future because there's not going to be the financial support to have as much professionalism in ministry. However, the ministry should be done by professionals. Okay.
And more of it, of course.
Right. All right. 2 Fs. Anybody want to get on the Google machine?
Professor.
All right, I got it. I use cursive. What else?
Way to go, Mom.
Yeah.
What kind of education
I got
you
spell
got?
check. Thanks for the spell check, Bob.
I think what the church has to play with too, and I'm hearing this a lot, because I hear why my mother goes to church. I sit by her every Sunday, so I know why she goes to church. But I also do a lot of work with youth, and I hear why they go to church, and they're not close.
Different whys? Or do you mean they're just not close to each other?
They're not close. The reasons why they attend church are way.
So what, do you have any examples? What if it's still forced family?
Well, we have a screen that will project the bulletin up on the order of service or words to the prayers, unison prayers up on the screen. My mother refuses to look at it.
Yes. That's awesome.
She says, I never look at that. has to look ahead.
Yeah.
I don't have any more concrete examples at the moment. That's
Okay,
okay.
Wayne, you had your hand.
Yeah, I just want to make an observation before I forgot about it. I've had a different experience at this church in Longmont, and real quickly, my experience was I was very involved in church when I was young. I went to Mountain View Boulevard Presbyterian Church. We drove 10 miles from University Hills into church Wednesdays and Sundays. I was in the youth group, and I was in the choir, and I had a blast. And then I went off to college and I studied philosophy, and I went, whew, organized religion, what a trip. And then I had a family. We started having babies, and when I brought the third baby for baptism and christening at the church, they said, you should really find a church closer to you, because I lived north of Boulder, and I was driving down to Mountain View, because that's where my mom and my grandma inherited from the common trip. And I said, yeah, church, maybe we should look into that. So I became a member in '92, and I have slowly become more and more involved in this church. We really chose this church because one of our children was in Montessori there. What I'm trying to say is this church it's not the leadership telling people what to do, it's other members saying, hey, can you help out with this? So it's in the business world, it's called customer marketing.
Wait, I'll come back to you. No, I'm kidding. Go ahead, get to the end of the workshop. Go ahead, Wayne. Get to the end of the workshop. Tell them what I'm going to say. No, I'm teasing. No, keep going, please.
But really, what I'm compelled to do things and to support the church and be on this committee and to do this because other members, not leadership of the church, other members are the chair or are on the committee and come on, do you have any time? Yeah, I have time, I can do this. And that's what pulls on my heartstrings. It's the same thing when it comes to, it's like public radio. It's like giving to public radio. I give to the church because I know that we need the money to keep this going and that going, and I want to keep hearing that programming, and so it's not the.
Did you give yesterday?
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's not like
Wayne is
sorry, your
paying
membership
for
doesn't know this
programming.
stuff. You have to sit in the back three pews, kind of thing. And I know that there are churches that run that way, and synagogues and other things. But this church has been this way for as long as I've been going. And everybody I bring to it says, I can't believe your church is so friendly. Everybody just comes up and talks to you, and they're so friendly. And I think that's the trick. How do you turn your congregation into the ones compelling involvement, compelling commitment, and regular attendance? And yeah, I'll do this. I know it means I have to keep doing this all through the summer, but I'll do it.
Right. And I'd like to come back to that, but I'll quote Phyllis Tickle again. She was talking about how, for so long, she's the one that talks about the great emergence that happens within the church and society every 500 years. And she said, okay, so we had authority as Christians. We had authority in the Pope. And then the Protestant Reformation happens, which I think is important to point out, because people pointed out to me, so it's important. I'm not trying to take it. But that this was a technological revolution, too. That, the printing press. So then there was, authority in the Bible. And what she said that it was interesting, and I haven't unpacked it to know if I agree with it or not, but she said that, one of the things about the issue around civil rights regarding sexual orientation, she says it's the last piece to play with biblical authority before we have to admit that biblical authority is different than what we said it was. That there are so many other rights that we've already acknowledged that then said, okay, well, biblical authority is different. And she says what makes it even harder is that for many that are holding on to it, it's about biblical authority. The point in that is to say the authority is shifting for those of us on the progressive end of Christianity. And I think the argument is that the authority is in community, which I think is what you're saying. That it's not because the Bible tells you to give to your church. It's not because, and I'm just going with what I heard, maybe he did tell you, but it's not that the Pope or your pastor told you, it's that the authority of the community and what the community expects or needs from you is what's driving that. But you mentioned something else, the family thing. And I want to talk, before we finish our fuss session, because Mom. I think that there's another element that at least I'm seeing. You said Sundays and Wednesdays. When I started in my church 5 years ago, Sundays were a sacred family day, and Wednesdays were the days that I could count on being able to have youth programming, because Wednesdays in town was when every church kid went to church. Now, I can't even get my kids to be available on Sunday morning. There's travel soccer, there's travel baseball, there's travel chess, there's travel math team. Forget about then the overworked family that finally gets a Sunday off that says, you know what? We're not moving. Let alone Wednesday evening too. For me in my area, it's these people, these college admissions officers that are, I'm not trying to make a bad guy, but it just works because they're not in the room, are they? Fine, we'll have a bad guy. They're saying, you need to do this and this and this to get into college, or get your kid into college. You've got to have this resume and that resume. Or you have to play on the travel ball team to make the school team, because you can't just play on the soccer team. If you're in the band in the fall, well, that's when the travel team plays. So you got to pick band or soccer. To me, it's institutional bullying. To say that you've got to be here and be there. And so how would the church that says, okay, you're not going to hell when you don't come to church? And my Baptist buddies got it easy. That's all they got to say. And then all of a sudden they're off the travel team and they're at church. But how do we as a progressive Christian group say, well, there's really no consequence? I mean, there's a consequence to us. We miss you. Well, I'm sorry, there's a consequence to me if I miss. So this institutional bullying that an open-minded intellectual stance from a church is going to lose to in terms of priority, I think plays into it too. I think each one of these specifically affects what our folks are hearing and saturated with. With political entertainment, I think there's a high saturation of political opinion. Due respect to a denomination, our denomination that's been prophetic for a long time. Prophetic. I think there's so much political opinion out there now that what some of our folks, particularly the younger parent generations that are looking to be more dualistic, might be thinking is, gosh, I don't want to think and talk about it anymore. We hear that a lot in our area. And our response is, well, gosh, I mean, what does the church say? Jesus was a political prisoner. I mean, there's certainly lots of us that feel that there's politics involved in our faith and faith involved in our politics. But I think we need to understand that there's a lot more of it going on everywhere, being discussed at every turn. There's less respectful dialogue and more vilification. There's more, you're an idiot, this guy's an idiot, you're a bad guy, you're evil. So I think there's a higher sensitivity, and I think this is what's leading people to say, I don't want to hear about it anymore, because there's not a lot of sacred conversation about anything. And I have to admit, I'll speak for myself. I've grown up in the UCC, and I have been as holier than thou as my evangelical brothers and sisters when I get to what I think is right, as I accuse them of being holier than thou. And I think that the folks that are just looking to go to church, and I'm not even advocating for people, but the reality is 45%, I heard the study that says nationally it's 20% identify no religious affiliation. I think this is part of it. There's less discussion about credible information, so we're not, everything we've heard on the news is just kind of what we're repeating, and I don't mean we, you and I mean we, general public.
Witness our recent presidential debates.
Oh, it's exhausting.
It was like the political entertainment.
Yeah.
Less credible, less.
Yeah, and I would suggest too that our political candidates are becoming caricatures. I'm not even talking about them as men and women. My personal opinion is they're caricatures. They're extremes. You can't, whatever happened to Jed Bartlett and West Wing, where they had these closed door discussions where they were acknowledging that the other had a point. Well, they're now, I'm out of my realm. Let me go back to where I.
Suits the medium.
Sure
You
does.
have to realize that makes
Political.
it entertaining.
Absolutely.
Goes in deeper than that, you turn up.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Hyper connectivity. I think there's higher anxiety in general. We see this with teenagers, and we can pick on the teenagers, but how many of us have gone on vacation and snuck away to check our email because we were just too anxious? What if we missed something?
Did you hear that they even have a word now for the kind of extreme anxiety when a kid's cell phone is taken away and he can't text anymore? They literally have physical reactions.
Yeah.
And they've termed it physical.
Yeah, and I think there's a social component because it's like being taken out of school because the school community continues. And who are they going to talk about? They're going to talk about the one not in the room. I mean, what do we think? Well, we think it's all about us. We're talking about us. There's YOLO, but what about FOMO, the fear of missing out? And I think that, what are you missing? What's going on? What's the Twitter feed saying? What's Facebook? Live streaming the world, the idea that I don't want to just go and watch the news. We all watch the news knowing what they're going to talk about now because we've got push notifications and we've seen the Twitter feeds, or people have been talking about it who have. We're even live streaming our worship because that's what they're going to be watching anyway. If they want to go worship, they're going to watch somebody's. Why not ours? And then life as an avatar. To me, this is a huge deal. I know violence in video games is excessive and scary, but to me, it's also scary that we could order our lunch from Chipotle online. I don't mean to say I don't, because I do. I'm not waiting in line. But it's scary in the sense that we are doing one more thing without human interaction. And it's not scary because we do that. It's scary because we're not creating many more opportunities for human interaction. My youth group used to be me talking. This workshop is me talking, and it's not reaching the need. Because what's happening is, what we're missing now is human interaction. Life is an avatar. You ever heard of this thing called Second Life? It's basically where people can go online, they create themselves in a computer world, and they have worship in a computer world. They have sex in a computer world. They go have coffee, hang out at bars, and they interact chatting with somebody else, but that's their life. And it seems very silly to those of us that are hearing about it, but you'll think about it and then go, it's actually sad.
For the longest time, I looked forward to plane flights because I'd love to talk to the people next to me. You have these interesting conversations with strangers, as you only can have with strangers. You can't have a conversation on a plane flight anymore. Most people have something in their ears, you can't even talk to them. And then the rest of them are looking at their screens, or you literally can't draw them away to actually have a conversation.
See, and I would say, for me, my most exciting aspect of the flight is the fact that my phone can't ring, so I can go write something without being interrupted. So it's not that I don't want to connect with you. I'm just excited that I'm not forced to connect with anybody else.
You have downtime on
Yeah,
that flight.
I can go write and do what I want. Now, I then feel anxious looking out the window, so I pick up my iPad and I play Temple Run 2 because I'm not used to just sitting there. That'd be weird. That's what I mean by the hyper anxiety. Go ahead.
I'm confused. Why doesn't anyone think it's a choice to not answer the phone?
Anybody want to answer that?
Kidding. It's like they just, I don't answer. It's like free.
Because we're trained.
Who trained you?
Society.
My church gave me a phone.
No, I'm talking about a sister of mine that's 10 years older than I am. And the phone rings and she'll have 2 phones on her ear.
Yeah.
She wasn't trained to do that. You know what I mean? It's like we don't see it as a tool that's helping us.
We might not see it as direct training, but I think there's a big part of society that says if you don't keep up with what we're throwing at you, you're going to be left behind. So for you to keep up, you better answer. You better have 5 phones on you, because
It's really interesting.
and that might be the expectation of us as church leaders too.
You better be available all the time. You better be available when I want you to be
everything to
available.
everyone
And if
all
you're
the
not, I'm really angry at you. In fact, I had that reaction from one person once. It's like, but I emailed you. Well, access my email once a day. Well, why didn't you access it the next 10 minutes? You know, I needed you then.
That was my experience.
My phone rings and I hit ignore because I'm in a conference, and the phones ring 3 more times because they know that I'm ignoring, which means they know I'm getting the call, which means they think I'm choosing. So there's an expectation that if I'm here, I'm also going to answer.
Another example I can share just briefly is somebody might message me on Facebook. I don't check my Facebook regularly, but lately I felt compelled to check it. I just did about 15 minutes ago because there was a message there that I knew I had to answer. And this is society training me. This is society that's got me wrapped around their little finger and having to demand. Now, I much prefer a phone call that I can see who called and not answer it. But I know people think that they can reach me because I've already responded.
Well, I think that there's a flip side of that with my generation where we don't call each other. So if the phone rings, something's wrong or something is really important and needs my immediate attention.
Your brother's like, dude, what are you calling for? Text.
Yeah. Text, right?
Yeah.
And I've actually told people, I turned off my text function on my phone, and it's off. Nobody can text me.
Yes.
And people got really angry at me that they couldn't send me a text.
But
And I said, well, you could always talk to me. Oh, no.
Each change in technology, though, has changed the expectations on the other end. In the office world, when the fax came in, suddenly we're not mailing things anymore. So now this paperwork can be responded to. Then we start getting emails. There are invisible phone calls that we need to respond to. Clients, exactly what you're saying. Well, I'm going to complain to your supervisor. I sent an email 5 minutes ago. And that's an actual example. I mean, it just keeps revving, and that's stressful.
The psychological role we call passive aggressiveness too.
But I like your point, Neil, which is if we're doing this because it makes our communications that are fairly trivial and all more efficient, real fast, I can shoot you, well, let's meet at 12, blah, 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 and we're saving the time for valuable human interaction, then maybe it'd be worth it to do that. Maybe we'd find it convenient.
My whole personal mantra is optimization, not maximization. I'm a new dad. I'm a youth minister. I'm trying to explore other things. And it's about not running out of gas. It's about getting better fuel mileage. And I think that's not where we're at yet. And part of this is social media. Because it's decreasing I said 5.1. Studies have shown that we're no longer 6 degrees apart from any other person. We are now 5.1 degrees apart. Yeah, awesome. There's no disconnect at all, but I think part of it is that this social media is generated from the bottom, which means that we as adults who are currently in positions of power are learning slower than the younger generation. So we're figuring out moderation, but the problem is the people who've been using it longer, the younger, didn't know moderation because it's not their job to moderate, it's our job. However, they didn't know that we didn't know. See, what happened is now they're adults and they don't know anything about moderation because the people who are supposed to be moderating didn't know anything about moderation because they didn't know about that. And so I think that's where we're trying to catch up, is learning to optimize this so that it is used by us, not using us. I think the last, one of the others is 24-hour program. Higher anxiety and pressure again. I need to get my kid into ballet. I need to get over to see this person. I've got 33 minutes. What am I going to do with them? Well, there's somebody waiting who needs 45 minutes. Then I'll be 15 minutes late, and that's okay. And I think this drives less commitment, especially to our church, because, again, we're not giving the ultimatum. The colleges are. The employers are. Even the social groups are. There's more activities, less reflection. I don't eat sitting down anymore. Unless I'm like, it's a special occasion. But I'm moving to the next thing. You eat. And so this whole nostalgia, for me, it's nostalgia of, sitting down at the dinner table is something that I've seen on TV before.
It's not only less reflection because there's no time for it, it's also, nobody sees the value of reflection anymore. What good is it? It's wasting time.
Well, and I think that that's driven, in my opinion, it's driven by the anxiety. It's not necessarily that there's no value in it in general. It's that there's a value that we're chasing that's driven by productivity and not reflection. And I submit to you that us as churches are doing the same thing. We'll get to there in a second. The need to plan something else to reach somebody else is the same thing, in my opinion. Hashtag IMO for you tweets out there. Twitter. Yes. And I think it also leads to church fatigue. The idea that it's just one more thing. Oh, I committed to church. And then I got to go help with the cookie sale. And then we got recitals. And then, as I said with the dualism, it's really hard against other institutions that are saying you have to do this or else. Our gospel of grace is not you have to do this or else, it's that we want you. And it's really hard to sell that argument. It's really hard, I think, to say, I know you feel like you have to do this, but we want you to do that. Because there's so many other things that our congregation members are throwing to the side because they don't have enough time to do everything they have to do, let alone choose to do something we want to do. And then mass violence. To me, I think it affects us this way. That there's a greater need now than ever before for safety. I think in general the bullying epidemic means that there's got to be a greater need for safety. And that you're not going to be judged, that you will not be criticized in an unfair manner. Except if you're a pastor and you're going to get criticized everywhere you turn. I think that there's a mix of all these different emotions, anger and grief and fear, and then the desire to act. I think there's a melting pot where people don't know what they want. It's kind of like what some of you were saying about earlier generations. I didn't know where else I could go to meet this eclectic gathering of emotions other than church. But I got to tell you, I was asked by my church, we do an adult education thing, and I love my church. I feel like they respect as many people as they can remember to respect at a time. And we've been having a sacred conversation about violence. And one session turned into, well, these teenagers and their video games and their movies. And I was thankful for the opportunity to then be commissioned by that group to form a sacred conversation on violence with teenagers. So I set up my camera kind of like Steve did, and I asked my questions. And we're going to hear from the teenagers what they're feeling. I tried it 3 times with 3 different groups of teens. And I couldn't get them to stick with talking about violence. All 3 times, different teenagers started talking about their parents and being frustrated with a disconnect. My word, not theirs. They were much more varied, like humans will be when they're gathered. But my conclusion was, every time they said, yeah, violence affects us and it's bad, they don't realize how their generation's more affected by violence than ours or another generation. What they feel is disconnected from their parents. And then I said, describe disconnect. They said, well, I feel like my parents care that I'm okay and that I get into a good cause and I do this, but once they figure out I'm okay, I don't feel like they care how I'm doing. That happened 2 of the 3 times. The other time, the group kind of started talking about how they feel like violence in video games is a natural progression, just like we used to play cowboys and Indians or cops and robbers, but the difference is that now kids are playing in their room, feeling connected to kids across the world, but not connected in their own communities, losing the spirit.
Family dinner's back.
Well, yeah, we can get there. But I was frustrated because, come on, talk about violence. We finally been given a voice. They're going to talk about you without you unless you talk about it. But I suggest with all of these things, there is a common theme that at least with this teenagers came across as disconnect. social media, 24-hour programming, dualism, mass violence even. I think what we're losing in this is connection. And it's a connection that I don't think you can really know you're missing. I think you have all these ways to connect still. We live in the most connected generation of all time. Yet, I suggest there's a disconnect with what can't be put on a slide. This is me not putting it on a slide. I think that what we're missing is the disconnect with the human spirit and the Spirit of God. And I think for a long time we've done a great job of talking about God. I think we've done really good in the UCC about talking about Christ. But I suggest and I feel like what we're not really encountering much is the Spirit. Let's do this. Let's stand up, stand back to back with somebody, but don't touch them. Just stand back to back. Force family flight. Here we go. I've done a lot of talking. We've done a lot of listening. It's time over. All right. Now here's the deal. You can't be touching. Now, this is an elimination game. Totally not my style. But I'm gonna ask your group to raise one hand. If both of you raise your hand, you can't be touching, cheaters. If you raise no hands as a pair, I'll ask both of you to sit down. If both of you raise your hand, I'll ask both of you to sit down. It'll just take a couple minutes. But I'll ask you a series of questions, and one of you will raise your hand. You can't look, no peeking. We'll see how it goes. Which one of you is taller? Would you raise?